mean, that's the
I mean,
thing.
that's a perfect
I mean,
example.
I do think, right, there was something about, there was somebody on the radio about business meetings and business travel. And they basically argued that, you know, that the trend already was a little bit against
Travel?
travel is just a sort of an unthinking thing, right?
Yes.
It's just, people, just travel, like, oh, I have a meeting in Atlanta. I'll go down in the morning and come back in the evening, right? And now people can have a meeting in Atlanta, Stockholm, and Houston on the same day
Right.
without going anywhere,
That's
right?
right.
And obviously that was possible before the
It does.
pandemic, right? But and probably we were moving in that direction anyway. We're just there faster.
Right.
And,
It is true, like the hotels got a.
Oh, I think it's going to be really rough on the hotels.
It's very rough.
Really rough.
Because I get the email from the union and everything else, trying to get the people back to work.
Now, would it help, Phyllis, if I turn off the lights in here?
No, I don't think so. I'm gonna try to move up a little.
Okay, yeah, you can get as close as you want. And worst comes to worst, I'll give you a book.
I think I can read this.
Okay, and I can also make this bigger.
Oh, yes, he could. Darker would be preferable, but bigger is, okay, substitute.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, and I can make it darker in the sense that I can turn off the
You got to turn
lights.
the light out when you want to do it.
Yeah, I don't think we need the lights.
Now, that's a weird thing. This is really weird. Okay?
So I'm delaying because we are expecting one more person.
The word darkness, number 2.
Yeah,
Darkeneth counsel.
yes.
So to speak of darkening counsel is a very weird combination. So what I'm going to ask you is darkness the only possible translation?
Huh.
That's really weird.
Machshich, yes, machshich. That, I'm sure you could find other translations, but and we can look at other translations. And I'm hoping David Wesley from 1550 is planning to join us.
Oh, I hope so. Because that can have a kind of variety of meanings.
What do you mean?
Darkeneth counsel
Yes.
can either mean make it muddy or make it confusing.
Yes, well, this translation gives murky counsel.
That's better.
Right?
That's much better.
Although that is definitely in my limited understanding of Hebrew, right? This word machshich comes from the root chashach, right? Which is to darken. Right? So choshech is darkness.
But it could still murky is
fine.
Yeah.
Murky is fine.
I like murky better.
Yeah. That is this translation, and we can see what Robert Alter does with it.
Okay. What does he do?
Let's see. That was among the reasons that I wanted.
Everybody has a different ways of saying stuff. Well, it has different implications. It does.
Yeah, darkening. So Alter is generally the person that I trust the most. He's, and it would be interesting to see what his printed translation says.
In some senses, darkness can also mean evil.
Yes, but I don't
think they mean it there.
I don't think in this case
That's
it means
murky,
evil.
Murky eliminates that.
Right. I think here and what we'll see, right? I'm going to make this one. I'm going to make bigger because it's only like.
Too light. Oh, that is better. Yeah.
Okay. So, but now I don't know where we are in the thing. Anyway, so hopefully David will show up. But I think what we'll do is, hi, Connie.
Oh, some more people.
Nice to see you.
Hey, how are you? So here in the room, you can't quite see them because we're trying to minimize the ambient light so that we can maximize the light of the screen so that people can see easily. We have, hi, Naomi.
Hello.
Oh, nice.
We have, in addition to me, we have Hedwig and we have Phyllis. And Connie is over at 1550. And Connie, David Wesley was going to come and join us over. He was going to take the T or the bus or whatever to come over here. But he's not here yet. So, but
Nice.
yeah, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to get this on. I'm not going to try to do that. I'm just going to do this, and then I'll try to put it on the television later. I mean, so I can't figure out this whole television thing. All right. So what we're reading today we have two different translations available to us. We have a translation that was written by what we call Old JPS, which is in part, it's sort of a Jewish version of the King James Bible. So it's sort of a Judaized version of it. Then we have Robert Alter's translation, which is from 1984. His printed Bible just came out. So I don't know if I left it at home. I'm still used to doing all this stuff from home. So my Altar Bible is at home. And so I don't know if he's actually revised that translation since 1984. It's a long time ago.
It is a long time.
So it's quite possible that he did make some changes. Go ahead, Connie.
I have the Book of God and Man, A Study of Job by Robert Gordis.
Great. And actually, Alter says, this is the little article that I found from Alter that he wrote in 1984. He had good things to say about that book. Does that have a translation, Connie, or is it just a commentary?
No, it has also translation.
That's great. Okay, and then I also have in front of me, I have the Art Scroll Chumash, but this only has traditional commentary, so it's not as helpful as Alter. It's a little bit too pious for my tastes. Whatever. What can you do? I don't mind a little bit of piety, but I like it leavened, with other stuff too. So, all right. All right. So just to sort of set the stage for where we are, and I'm not going to worry about David. He can watch the YouTube up to this point if he ends up, or he can just watch the YouTube. To set the stage, right? We all know the story of Job, right? Who was seen as a good man. And lost his entire family, right? And then, as if that weren't enough, also then became very ill, and he lashes out, right? He recites a beautiful poem, right, of total despair, right, essentially wishing that he hadn't been born, right? And it's very interesting, and Alter talks about this in this article, right, that in that chapter 3 poem, which I don't think we'll review right now, but you can go back and look at it, and you can also, if you are tech savvy, you can go back and look at I think we made a YouTube of it. I hope we made a YouTube of it. God, maybe we didn't.
I hope you do, but I won't check it out.
Yeah. But the basic point of that thing is that, that it would be better to be dead, right? Or actually better not to have been born, right? Than to suffer the way that humans end up suffering. And so the imagery of darkness, right, that Phyllis has already pointed out, right, is crucial, because that is what Job wants, right? Job wants to sort of impose total and eternal darkness, right? And the womb would always be closed up, right? And there would be no life, right? And then in the sort of, because that sort of non-life, or as they call it in the Superman movie that I just watched with my kid, the Justice League movie, the Zack Snyder cut, which is brand new on HBO Max. I don't recommend it, but if you have a 17-year-old, you might want to watch it with them. The bad guy is very interested in something called anti-life. He wants to find the anti-life. And so in a sense, that is sort of a comic book distillation of what Job is asking for in some sort of, and not because he's a villain, right? But because of the enormity of his suffering, right? That's how terrible his suffering is, that non-existence seems preferable, right? So we get in the book of Job, right? Then we have this long intermediary section. We read a little bit of it, right? Where we have Job has 3 friends. Each of them tells Job that he's a wackadoodle and that he clearly, if he's suffering, right, it's his own fault, and he should figure out what he did wrong, make atonement, and everything will be fine, right? And he insists to them up and down that he did nothing wrong, right? There's a bunch of textual problems with the text as it's been received. We don't need to go into those, right? Eventually, what happens, we get to the climax, right? From chapter 3 to chapter 38, that's a lot of chapters, right? Of beautiful poetry, but we don't need to go into them. We get to the what we call the voice of God out of the whirlwind. So Vaya'an, right? So God responds, right? Here answered, right? But God responds to Job from the Sa'ara, right? So translated famously as the whirlwind. Let's see how our scroll translates it. Also whirlwind, probably again, I think that's how King James translated it. Connie, how does Gordis translate chapter 38, verse 1?
Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, saying.
Okay, so we like the whirlwind, right? Yeah. Author says that's wrong. He says that it's the storm. It's out of the storm, right? Which whirlwind, in a sense, right, could be a kind of storm, right? Yeah.
But storms in the desert can be windstorms.
Right. So, right.
And JPS calls it a tempest.
A tempest. Okay, so a tempest. The tempest is not a whirlwind, right? But the point is, author says it's a storm. Tempest is like a storm, right? So a storm in the desert could be a whirlwind, but. And again, I'm not here to say that one translation is wrong, one translation is correct, right? I don't claim that level of knowledge. Again, I tend to trust author maybe a little bit too blindly on these things, but he says, but I do think there is a slightly different feeling about a storm than from a whirlwind, right? Yes. And so I think this storm, right, really has that same sort of sense of violence, right? But it also has a little bit more enormity to it, I think, sort of a feel.
I see storm as more usual.
Yes.
More normal in the course of events.
Right.
Whereas a whirlwind is really unusual.
Right. At least in these parts.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So this is God talking, right? Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man. Right, Kagever, be a man, Job, for I will demand of thee. I'm going to ask you, right, and you need to tell me. Hodieni, right? You will declare, right? So he's challenging Job, right? Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast the understanding. Who determined the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Or who stretched the line upon it? Whereupon were the foundations thereof fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof? When the morning stars sang together, and all of the sons of God shouted for joy. Were you there at this, in the act of creation? Were you a part of that? Or who shut up the sea with doors when it broke forth? and issued out of the womb. Now, actually, this one I think it's worth, we'll come back to this one. I think we'll come back to it in Alter's translation, because I do think Alter's translation works better. Right? Very interesting, right? Who shut up the sea with the doors when it broke forth and issued out of the womb. When I made the cloud the garment thereof, and a thick darkness as a swaddling band for it, and prescribed for it my decree, right? Chuki, my law, and set its bars and doors, and said, thus far shalt thou come, but no further, and here shall thy proud waves be stayed. Hast thou commanded the morning since the days began, and caused the dayspring to know its place, that it might take hold of the ends of the earth, and the wicked shall be shaken out of it. It is changed as clay under the seal, and they stand as a garment. But from the wicked their light is withholden, and the high arm is broken. Hast thou entered into the springs of the sea, or hast thou walked in the recesses of the deep? And I'll just point out here that this is one place. So the one thing I love about these very pious books is that they will on occasion make reference to something contemporary if it supports their piety, right? So one thing that they say is, have you ever been in the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep, right? No one in the time that Job was written, of course, had been in the very depths of the sea, but it says, but modern exploration has revealed, right, the wonders that are at the bottom of the ocean. So, okay, that's fine. The Bible was right about that. It's true. The sea is an amazing place. All right. Have the gates of death been revealed unto you? Or hast thou seen the gates of the shadow of death? Hast thou surveyed into the breadths of the earth? Declare if thou knowest it at all. Where is the way to the dwelling of the light? And as for darkness, where is the place thereof? That thou shouldest take it to the bound thereof, and that thou shouldest know the paths to the house thereof. Thou knowest it, for thou wast then born, and the numbers of thy days is great. All right. All right, so that's the end of the first sort of section. So what is this first section about?
All about nature that only God has done, commanded, created.
Exactly. It's about creation, right? It's about creation. It's about the context of our world, right? Which, maybe because of the miracle of modern science, we contemporary people, modern people, have a slightly stronger grasp of some of these issues than maybe Job would, right? But I think that these types of questions are very often the ones that really inspire scientists, right? It's one of the well springs of science, right? Is that we haven't been to the bottom of the ocean and we want to go there, right? We haven't been to the recesses of space and we want to go there, right? We want to figure out how all of these things work, right? And I think for many people, the more we learn about these topics, right, the more we realize A, the complexity, and B, how much more there is to learn, right? Which is a remarkable thing. Let's see who this is.
But it's
It's Helen. Hello, Helen. Go ahead,
Hello,
Naomi.
Rabbi.
Go ahead, Naomi.
It also feels like this is God putting Job in his place. I'm
Yeah.
thinking you are.
Right. So Alter talks about this, right? Isn't this just God bullying Job,
Yeah.
right? And it is an interesting question, right? And I go back and forth because sometimes I feel like, yeah, he's kind of talking down to Job, right? On the other hand, I also have this sort of sense, right, that he's reminding Job a little bit of Job's own poem, right? Of Job's own complaint, right? Job's complaint was all about wanting to die, right? Or wanting not to have been born, right? Or not to have been created. It's about wanting all darkness.
Yeah, but
Yeah, but wait a minute.
Hold on one second. This Hetty and then Naomi.
I said, I think the way he thinks, he said, I was born, but what could I do? What could I do with my life? Maybe he doesn't know what he wants to do with his life.
Well, I think, right. I mean, I think that he, his life has been turned upside down.
And he doesn't know what.
Right. He doesn't know how to,
Anyway.
right. He wants to get out of it.
Yes.
Yeah. Go ahead, Naomi.
That's very much what I was going to say. I mean, Job would not be doing this if he still had his house, his lands, his family, et cetera, et cetera. But God has chosen to decimate those. So I think Job has a beef.
Right. Oh, I mean, and I think that that's what's kind of an interesting perspective. Like, imagine, right? I mean, I think what's really interesting about this, and actually the Pious book helped me understand this, right? Is that if Job didn't have a beef, right? And I think actually Gordis makes this point also, Connie. If I didn't read Gordis, but this is the point that Alter mentioned from Gordis, right? Is that if God didn't think that Job had a beef, right, then God wouldn't have responded to Job, right? So, and in the words of the Pious book, right, Job is essentially turned into a prophet. Right, the only people that receive direct response from God, right, are prophets. And so there's a level of respect that God is giving to Job, right, by addressing Job in this very direct way, right, and so that God's presence, right, is in itself a recognition that Job does have, that Job really is suffering, right? It's not to take that away, right? It's also, though, I think that this is part of the point, right? Whereas Job talks only about darkness, right? God speaks about darkness and light, right? That there's darkness and light, and that you can't have one without the other, right? Whereas Job talks about wishing that he hadn't been born, right? There's throughout this poem, but already here in the context of creation, right? We have all this imagery about birth, right? The wombs of the sea, right? There was another one too. Right. Oh, the wombs of the sea, right, and that the sea is sort of a primordial mother, right?
Swaddling clothes.
Yes, the swaddling clothes, right, of the newborn earth, right? The darkness is not a status of badness, right? Darkness is a swaddling cloth, right? It's a way of comforting a newborn, right? And that actually, yes, it takes a decree, it takes bars and doors, right? And that the sort of primordial sea, which is the mother of all, right, is also a destructive force, right? So that it requires, the sea needs to be told, thou shalt come this far, but no further. And here thy proud waves be stayed, right? So that there's this kind of creation is very much this balancing act, right? Of that creative life force, right, is also potentially destructive. And then finally, right, that Job talks about suffering and distress, and right, and God sort of reminds him, right, that creation is also joy, right? Let's see if someone's there. Someone closed the door. Hold on, excuse me 1 second. David Weston was supposed to join us from Goldman, but he's not here, so I thought maybe it would be. Thank you. No, thank you. I appreciate it. Right. So there's this shouting, right? There's the shouting of joy that is associated with creation, and we do this all the time, right? In Jews, right, among Jews, right, in the synagogue, right, we talk about the first blessing before the Shema is dedicated to this whole penumbra of creation, right? And the way that light in the morning, right, and the alternation of light and dark in the evening. And it's, these are joyful topics, right? God isn't, again, I don't think in this case God is denying the reality of suffering, right, or the reality of death, right? It's just that there's this counterbalance. And in a certain sense, I think what the suggestion is, and we'll see this, I think, throughout the poem, right, is that it's very difficult for humans with their relatively narrow perspective, right, to pull all of the fullness of existence, the fullness of creation, the fullness of the world, into that perspective, right? Maybe we can get glimpses of it at times, what is Wordsworth call them? Visionary moments, something like this, where there's like, you have these little intimations, right? Of the fullness, right? That poetry and other experiences can happen. I mean, I just remember like the birth of my children, were among those moments where you get the sort of, you go beyond, it's a good thing, it's a bad thing, it's just too much to sort of fully grasp in your head. All right, so thoughts. Go ahead, Connie.
And as much as he describes the creation and how much Job does not aware of the wholeness of it, he also does point out that he's also going to take care of the wicked and the arrogant. Man.
Right. And that's very interesting, right? He does say, right, that there's this interesting kind of way, which I have to say I don't entirely understand. I don't get it, right? That somehow the morning, right? The morning is somehow a process of shaking the evildoers out of the world. I'm not really sure how that works. It's a nice thought.
Right.
Right. But notice also what he doesn't say. Right, he doesn't say that people who are righteous will not be shaken out of the earth. Right. It's so. And again, I don't know where I read this, but this is not an idea that was mine. Right, that God seems to be willing to acknowledge, right, that evildoers will exist and maybe even thrive. Right, God does not address directly, right, the reality that innocent people suffer. Right, so it's not clear, exactly what we're supposed to do with that, except for somehow put it into this larger cosmological context of creation, right? That creation, the joy and the beauty and the majesty of creation requires all of those. They require a creative power that also can destroy. And what's interesting here, actually, in that vein, right, is this whole thing that we talked about here about shutting up the sea, right, and putting a limit on it, right? There's an echo here, first of all, of the Jewish creation story, right, from Genesis, right, where God makes a boundary, right, between the waters above and the waters below, right? God sort of makes room for the atmosphere, right? And then that is in its own way, right, an echo of an older Mesopotamian idea of creation, right, where the sea, right, and the sea, the sort of primordial source of everything, right, is actually cut in half in a big battle between the creator God, right, and the sea, right. And so this is a sort of a peaceful version of that, right? But we sort of see, right, that there's the possibility that the sea is going to sort of overwhelm everything. All right. So the first, as I said, the first part of the story, right, and I think that this is the other thing that Alter helped me see, right, is that this poem in its own way is a narrative.
How you doing? How's the leg?
In many ways, this poem is a kind of narrative, right? It's not just a story, right? But that it moves from this cosmological, right? It's kind of the story of creation, right? And now we'll get to the story of weather, right? It's not just, oh, God made this beautiful creation, right? And everyone's happy. And he contained the seas and this and that and the other thing. Now we have weather, right? All right, so the next thing is the weather. There it is. Okay. All right. Oh, and then also, right, this was, I thought, what Alter was really was saying, right? In verse 21, right, thou knowest all this, right? Not only like it's almost now not a question, like, could you know this? Right now it's almost like this declaration, which I suppose could be taken as sort of sarcasm. Hold on one second, Sadie. As sarcasm, but I'm not sure. Right? Yadata ki az tivaled. Right? You know this, right? Because after all, you were born. Right? And umispar yamecha rabim. Right? And the number of your days is very great. Right? So that part, maybe it might seem a little bit sarcastic, but the first part, right, again, does seem like a rejoinder to Job's poem, right? That after all, you were born. You actually do have an experience of creation, right? You have lived in this amazing world that's around us, right? Yeah, go ahead, Connie.
So many of us are so unaware
Right.
of the beauty or of around us.
Right. I mean, right. And there's a way in which, and I love this, right? Yadata, this is why I don't want it to be sarcastic, right? Yadata ki az tivaled, right? You, or maybe it could be, you can know this because after all, you were born, right? So you actually do have the capacity, even amidst your suffering, right, of looking outside and marveling at the world, right? Marveling at the miracles of creation. And I do have this sense of, in the context of my own tsuris, right? I mean, we all have our tsuris, right? Our suffering, right? That there are times, right, when I recognize that when the tsuris seems completely overwhelming, right? One thing that often really helps, which is, I can't believe how simple it is. I need to go onto my back deck and look over the beautiful oh, I never shared the screen with you. Sorry, everybody. So I'm yelling this thing to you and you can't even see it. Okay. So hold on. I don't know what I just did. Something bad.
Oops.
Oh dear, okay.
There we go. Okay. All right. There we go. There we go. So I'm just gonna, this is what I need to look at. I'll show you what I need to look at. I can even look at it on my computer, right? I can just look at that, right? And almost every time, right, that I remind myself, oh my gosh, I get to live here, right? I have, the tsuris becomes maybe just slightly, but, a little bit more bearable. All right. All right, so let's move to weather, and we'll try to get through weather, and then next week we will tackle the animals.
Okay.
So those are the three categories. The three categories are creation in general, the weather, and then the animals. Starting with quote unquote real animals, and then moving to sort of mythological animals, which I think is really fascinating. So let's continue here with the weather. Hast thou entered the treasuries of the snow, or hast thou seen the treasuries of the hail, which I have reserved against the time of trouble, against the day of battle and war? By what way is the light parted, or the east wind scattered upon the earth? Who hath cleft a channel for the water flood, or a way for the lightning of thunder? To cause it to rain on a land where no man is, on the wilderness wherein there is no man, to satisfy the desolate and waste ground, and to cause the bud of the tender herb to spring forth. Hath the rain a father? Or who hath begotten the drops of dew? Out of whose womb came the ice and the hoarfrost of heaven? Who hath gendered it? The waters are congealed like stone, and the face of the deep is frozen. Canst thou bind the chains of the Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Canst thou lead forth the Mazarot in their season, or canst thou guide the bear with her sons? Knowest thou the ordinances of the heavens? Canst thou establish the dominion thereof in the earth?
What's Mazarot?
I'm assuming it's another constellation, but it's not one that I'm familiar with.
Okay.
And I'm assuming bear means Ursus. Knowest thou canst thou lift up thy voice to the clouds, that abundance of waters may cover thee? Canst thou send forth lightnings that they may go and say unto thee, here we are? Who hath put wisdom in the inward parts? And who hath given understanding to the mind? Who can number the clouds by wisdom? Or who can pour out the bottles of heaven, when the dust runneth into a mass and the clods cleave fast together? All right, so then, as you can see, we then, in verse 39, we turn to animals, right? The lioness. All right, so overall thoughts about the weather.
Well, it's the same, God has created these, and God is telling Job that this is what he has created, and what have you done?
So God
Yeah.
is going down to Job's level.
Well, right. I mean, I think that is definitely one way of reading the poem. And if that were the case, then I would have to question, right? Why would we bother? If that were the only answer to Job, right? Why would we bother with this?
Well, you're saying that the fact that God is communicating with Job puts him in the category of a prophet. But So what sort of prophecy, or do we get enlightened about this at the end, but what sort of message is Job as a prophet expected to send?
Well, that's what's interesting, because I don't know that I necessarily agree with the idea of Job as a prophet, because generally the role of the prophet, right, is that yes, the prophet is supposed to communicate something from God to the people,
Yeah.
and also to be the defender of the people against God. Right? There's the two roles of the prophet. We tend to think about the first one, right, all the time, but we don't think about the second one. So for instance, Jonah is not a very good prophet, right? Because he actively, tries to avoid doing his job, but he's also actually a remarkably good prophet, because he's one of the few prophets where the people actually listen to him, right? And they change their ways, and God relents. But so I'm not sure that Job is actually a prophet, except in the sort of larger sense that that God actually, as I said, God responds to Job's defense of man, in a sense. And I would say that the message, and this is the message, we've already sort of gotten to this message, but it bears repeating, right? The message appears to be, right, that your lament, right, although understandable, right, is not actually a defense of man. It's not a defense of people, right? It's actually that Job's lament, although, as I said, potentially, I think we can understand it, we can empathize with it, right? But that Job is asking for death, and God is saying life is what you get, right? But life is all of it, right? Life is all of it. It's the good and the bad, right? It's the unutterable suffering, right? And it is the overwhelming joy. It's the supreme destructiveness and the fecundity. Yeah, go ahead, Phyllis.
It seems to me in this section, God is stressing his role as measurer.
Mm.
And perhaps there's a hint there that he's measuring Job's troubles. I don't know.
Oh, interesting. I love the thought, right? That God is sort of trying to lay some sort of boundaries to the suffering, right? Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I do think that's what's so fascinating about this poem, right? Is the amount of measuring, carpentry, right? Pile driving, right? Plumbing. I mean, there's a lot of trades going on here, right? The building trades are well represented, right? But also, yeah, go ahead, Connie. Yeah.
Also, the feeling of order and
Yeah.
cause and effect here.
Right. And I think, right. And again, whether we agree with this or not, I mean, I do think that it's I actually think it's, for us in our world, in the world of climate change, right. And of, what feels sometimes like impending climactic disaster, right? We begin to, one of the things that science continues to show us, right, is the degree to which, things are interconnected, right? I don't want to say necessarily that things are orderly, right? In the way that, say, the first book of Genesis, the first chapter of Genesis wants everything to be very orderly. Right, but the things are all very interconnected. Here, I do think there's a way in which, I'm not sure how much I buy this, but there is a way in which God does seem to be asserting God's own control, right, over the weather, right? Which I think we can say, right? One of the things that I think is so interesting, right, is that what does he say here? Basically, can you cause the weather to happen, right? Where does he say this?
Cause it to rain.
Can you call?
26.
Right? Can you cause it to rain? Right? Can you do this? Right? And then hath the rain have a father, or who hath begotten the drops of dew? Right? And so again, we have this sort of sense that I do think in a certain sense humans have. Oh, that's a little later, but here, right? We have this again. We have this birth imagery, right? We have this imagery of childbirth, right? And that God is both. God seems to be implying that God is both mother and father, right? To the forces that bring and end life, right? In terms of like rain and dew being the source of life, right? And we're at right at Passover, we're at that point in the synagogue service where we switch from the asking for rain to the asking for dew, right? But God is equally, right, the mother and father of ice, right? Of the cold, the chill, right, which is the end of life, right? Which I think is so fascinating, right? That sort of life and death are there along with all of this birth imagery, right? And then to make the point here that I was beginning to make, right? That where does he say? Oh boy, I don't know. I can't find what I'm looking for. Oh, here, right, right before that, right? To satisfy the desolate and waste ground, right? God will make it rain, right, where there are no people, right? So then this is also very interesting, right? To remember that God has a whole planet to worry about, right? God is not only worried about people. And again, to sort of put our own experiences into a larger context, right, which goes against our egoism, right? It goes against our sense of like, well, wait, no, I'm the most important person in the world, and people are more important than anything else in the world, So okay, that's a little upsetting, but and Alter points out, right, that in fact the Bible rarely does this. Right? By and large, the Bible is very much focused on humans being just a little less than an angel, right? And so Job is sort of a humbling, and so actually this sort of hectoring tone that we're picking up, or this idea that God is bullying Job, if we take it out of Job versus God, and put sort of every person is Job, right? It's putting humanity in its place, right? It's putting people in their place. Like I actually care about all those parts of the world where there are no people. Not that there's and there's still many of those in the world, right? Mm-hmm. Populations are becoming more concentrated, not less so. All right. Any other thoughts about this section?
For me, who's not a believer, it seems so elementary. They're giving all the power to God, and if it changes or if it whatever it does, they don't have a better answer, so they accept.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Sandy, for that, because I think that I had this thought beforehand, and and I think that I think you're bringing up something that's very important, right? And I think that one of the and Alter, here I'm completely reliant on Alter for this point, right? Is that it's very important to remember, right, that all of this is happening in the context of poetry, right? And that the poetry, which we only have, kind of a shadow of it because we're reading it in English as opposed to in the Hebrew, right? Is that much, which is very true in general, right? That much of the power of poetry, right, is not in the summary of what the words mean, right? It's in the experience of the poetry of the poem as a whole, right? Yeah, go ahead, Connie.
It's also important to realize in the context of when this was written.
Right.
We look at it from our point of view, from today, 2021.
Right.
And
I think that we also look at it from a perspective of of English speakers, reliant on guides to help us through this very, very difficult Hebrew, right? What I find so fascinating about what Alter is saying, right, is that the book of Job is by far, he claims, the most exquisite poetry in the Bible. And in the book of Job, these chapters of God speaking to Job are the most exquisite poetry within the book, right? And so that there's a way, right, in which the quality of the poetry itself is sort of speaking, beyond the content, quote unquote, of the poetry, right? The poetry itself is getting at something.
Sure. Could you put it on the table? That's fine.
That the poetry itself is conveying, right? And again, and remember, right, that the pious book doesn't talk about this, right? The pious book basically thinks that this is God talking.
Yeah.
Right? This is actually God talking. Alter, and I'm assuming Gordis, understand, right, that this was written by a human being, right? So when we think about it as something that's written by a human being, right, something, sort of at the level of Homer or of Milton, right, or of Dante, right, we begin to get the sense, right, of how sublime this poetry actually is, and that the answer and just that sort of distinction, right, between the thematic distinctions between the poem that Job says, right, with its very cribbed and focus on death and darkness and not being born, right, that the incredible fecundity and beauty and light and dark and all this sort of thing of the poetry that's put into the mouth of God, right? We can get a sense of that just from the summary. So I think what we'll do for the last 5 minutes for today is that we will actually look at Alter's translation as it was in 1984. And as I said before, I don't know for a fact that Alter hasn't revised this translation. It's quite possible that he did. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. So who is this darkening count? So it's, and remember, he says it's not from the whirlwind, it's from the storm. Whether he's right or not, I don't know. Okay, so who is this darkening counsel? In words without knowledge, gird up your loins like a man. I'll ask you, and you may inform me. Where were you when I founded it? Tell if you know understanding. Who set its measures? Do you know? Or who stretched the line upon it? In what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, all the sons of God shouted for joy, hedged the sea in with doors when it gushed forth from the womb. When I made cloud its clothing, deep mist its swaddling bands, placed on it breakers as my limit, set up bolt and doors, I said, thus far come no farther. Here halt the surge of your waves. Did you ever muster the morning, appoint dawn to its place, to seize the corners of the earth that the wicked be shaken from it? It turns like sealing clay, till fixed like the hues of a garment. Their light is withheld from the wicked, the upraised arm is broken. Have you come to the depths of the sea? At the ends of the deep walked about? Have the gates of death been shown you? The gates of gloom have you seen? Can you take in the breadth of the earth? Tell if you know all. Where is the way light dwells and darkness? Where is its place? That you may take it to its home, understand the path to its house. You know, for you were then born, the number of your days is great. Have you come into the storehouse of snows? The storehouse of hail you have seen, which I set aside for time of strife, the day of war and battle. By what way is the west wind spread, the east wind whipped across earth? Who cut the torrent a channel, a way for the thunderstorm, to rain upon the land without man, wilderness without human soul, to sate the wild wasteland, to make the grass sprout there? Does the rain have a father? Or who sired the drops of dew? From whose belly did the ice come forth? To the frost of heaven, who gave birth? Like stone water congeals, the face of the deep blocks hard. Can you tie bands to the Pleiades, or loose Orion's rings? Can you bring out Mazarot in season, conduct the bear with its cubs? Do you know the laws of the heavens? Can you fix their rule on earth? Can you lift your voice to the cloud, and the water spate covers you? Can you order the lightning to go, make it say, here I am? Who put wisdom in the hidden parts? Who gave the mind understanding? Who told the heavens in wisdom, the bottles of the heavens? Who tipped down when dust melts to the mass and clods clump together? All right, so we'll stop the share for now.
Rabbi, what's a storehouse of snow and a storehouse of ice?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think it probably is a kind of ancient imagining of where the snow comes, from probably like that there's, that up in heaven somewhere, there's these vast factories that produce snow. And God sort of piles it up until he needs it. Which is
He needs it for time of trouble, it says.
Yeah, right, exactly.
For battle and war. I guess
Right.
he uses it, weaponizes it.
Right. That's a great image. God weaponizes the weather.
That's it.
Exactly.
Oh,
All right. Anyone have a final thought? And next week we'll do the animals.
Okay.
Any
Rabbi.
final thought? Naomi? Connie?
I was just thinking of God sending a great snowstorm to stop a war, or
Like in Russia.
Yes,
Remember?
right.
Oh, yeah.
Twice, right? Twice. Amazing. It's a really interesting thought.
Yeah,
It is.
yeah.
Thank you, Naomi. Thank you, Connie. Thank you, Sandy.
Thank you, Rabbi.
All right. Thank you, Phyllis and Hetty.
Okay.
We'll reconvene next week for the sequel.
Yes.
All right, good.